Hello. Today I want to talk about the ending of Arthur Miller's All My Sons, and in particular Joe Keller's suicide. One of the problems that we as readers have is that we just don't know what to do with this suicide. I mean, why does he do it? And how should we react to it? And some folks say he's a coward, right? He doesn't want to face the reality of what it is that he's done. And other folks perhaps kind of think about the fact that maybe there's sort of a larger symbolic reason why he does commit suicide. And I want to talk about all of that today, and I also want to focus a little bit on the fact that this is a play that is really sort of saturated with suicide talk. From the very beginning, we have the threat of a suicide. We have a suicide that takes place off stage that we find out about at the end of the play. We have a suicide that takes place on the stage, or rather in the backdrop, and we hear it happening. And then we have the potential for a fourth talk of suicide. And we'll get into that as we go through the presentation. But I want to kind of shape this discussion around why we have sort of a mixed reaction to suicide in the play itself. And it's because we have a mixed reaction to suicide in society in general. For example, several years ago, there was a gentleman by the name of Matt Hughes. He was a storm chaser featured on Discovery Channel Storm Chasers TV series. And during one of the seasons, they had gone out and had a very successful storm chase. They had intercepted a tornado, and it was a big triumph for them. And then the next weekend, Matthews went and attempted suicide, and he wound up dying from his injuries. And I relayed this story to one of my friends, and in the conversation that followed, I remember him saying that, wow, that was a cowardly thing for him to do. After all, he has this family that's supporting him. Why would he do such a thing? It's not worth it. It's not appropriate for him to go and take his own life. It's a very selfish act for him to do. Then we have someone like Brittany Maynard, who fairly recently was the center of a topic of discussion involving physician-assisted suicide. And she, of course, was diagnosed with a terminal disease. And people very much advocated for her. Well, it's her body. She should have the right to be able to die with dignity in the way that seems appropriate for her rather than suffering through a prolonged illness. And no matter how you slice the bread on this one, we have two individuals who took their own lives. Matt because of a psychological issue that he was dealing with, and Brittany because of a biological one, because of a chronic disease. And of course, not wanting to psychologically have to deal with the physical consequences of that. And yet, we'll say one suicide is inappropriate and the other one is. But both of them have the control over their bodies, so why should we say, well, one person can and the other person can't? Now, I'm not going to debate the whole purpose and relevance or righteousness of suicide. I'll leave that as a conversation for a different class on a different day. But it's important to notice that we're bringing this conception of suicide to our reading of All My Sons. And I think it colors the way that we label one person who commits suicide and the way that we label another. First, let me talk about the suicide that didn't happen, and it was never going to happen in the first place. That's Mother's. At the very beginning of the play, she says, if Larry's dead, I'm going to kill myself. I swear I'm going to kill myself. And as readers, when we first encountered that, we probably immediately sensed the melodrama. Right? She's not going to do it. She's just doing that to over-exaggerate her feelings towards probably the reality that Larry's not coming back. Right? After all, we see the way throughout the course of the play that she tries to switch subjects. At one point, when Chris is insisting upon something, she says, oh, can you get me an aspirin? I have a headache. She has all the right melodramatic moments. So we don't really ever believe that she's suicidal. And she's not. She's putting on a big act. Because the reality is, she's already accepted the fact that Larry's not coming back. She understands the people in her family better than absolutely anyone else does. She probably knows why Larry's not coming back and who's responsible for him not coming back. That's why she's so preoccupied with telling Joe that out of everyone else, he has to believe that Larry is alive. Even though Joe is still trying to say, yeah, Larry's not alive, he's not coming back, and that's the end of it. Mother knows exactly what Larry has probably done, so she's not going to commit suicide. But that colors us in some way. Because Joe says almost the exact same thing later in the play. If there's something larger than a father-son relationship, I'll put a bullet in my head. And we're inclined to say, oh, melodrama again, except for the fact that Joe actually puts a bullet in his head. So Miller, in some respects, kind of bluffs us with Mother, but we have to remember, too, she's also the strongest character in the play. Literally, at the end of this play, she is the only character left standing. Now let's think about Larry's suicide. And I think that it doesn't get enough attention because Joe's suicide takes up so much of it, right? Larry kills himself. And yet, I very rarely hear students say, I don't think I've ever heard students say that Larry's a coward for doing so. So why does he do it? Well, this is very, very old-fashioned classical thinking in terms of the relationship between fathers and sons, right? Let's revisit Larry's suicide note for just a moment, and I'm just going to read his note as incomplete as it is so we can kind of see what we get off of it. Here's what Larry tells us. My dear Anne, it is impossible to put down the things I feel, but I've got to tell you something. Yesterday they flew in a load of papers from the States and I read about Dad and your father being convicted. I can't express myself. I can't tell you how I feel. I can't bear to live anymore. Last night I circled the base for 20 minutes before I could bring myself in. How could he have done that? Every day 3 or 4 men never come back and he sits back there doing business. I don't know how to tell you what I feel. I can't face anybody. I'm going out on a mission in a few minutes. They'll probably report me missing. If they do, I want you to know that you mustn't wait for me. I tell you, Anne, if I had him here now, I could kill him. There's a couple of things that are going on in the suicide note. First of all, Larry can't force himself to come back in and face anyone. That's a psychological thing, right? He believes that because his father is responsible for his brothers, his fellow pilots, falling out of the sky, that he is somehow guilty. Larry has done nothing wrong here. There is no reason for him to feel guilty. Yet there's the classical idea of the sins of the father falling on the head of the son. And we have to wonder what it is that Larry knows about what Joe Keller did. And there's one line in the suicide note that I think is especially problematic and we might be inclined to gloss over it. Yesterday they flew in a load of papers from the States and I read about Dad and your father being convicted. Now, Miller has left us with this really cryptic line because we know in Joe Keller's trial that the first time he was convicted and the second time he was exonerated. So what exactly did Larry know? It seems to suggest here that if Joe was in jail and was being properly punished for the crime, Larry would have no reason to kill himself because the sins of the father would not need to fall on the head of the son. Because Larry commits suicide, we have to infer that Larry knows that Joe got away with it. And that's probably reinforced by this line afterwards, right? When he winds up specifically saying, every day 3 or 4 men never come back and he sits back there doing business. At this point, Joe wouldn't be doing business if he was sitting in jail. Larry has to know that Joe pulled a fast one and that he got away with it and that Joe is responsible for it. So why does he kill himself? To right the wrong that his father has committed. Since his father is not being properly punished for the crime, Larry spills his own blood. And there's another reason for it. He says, if I had him here now, I could kill him. But he can't kill him. And a son would not kill his own father. So Larry does the next best thing. He kills himself. Because in killing himself, he's killing his father. He's killing the bloodline. So Larry's suicide, it's based upon a psychological perception that life is no longer worth living because of what his father did. Would that make him a coward? It sounds like he has the same issue that Matt Hughes, as I mentioned previously, was having, a psychological reason for no longer living. He would have had a full life ahead of him, and yet he chooses to end his own life. This is Old Testament justice, really, in a lot of respects. And what's interesting, Mother says previously that God does not let a son be killed by his father. And that was a reference to the Old Testament, specifically to the Abraham-Isaac story, where God calls Abraham out into the wilderness and bids him to sacrifice his own son as a test of faith. When Abraham goes, he binds Isaac and has the knife raised, he's going to sacrifice him. God says, wait a minute, you shouldn't do this. Right? Instead, sacrifice this lamb. You've demonstrated your faith to me. So when Mother says it, of course, it's not so much the idea of God the Almighty is the one who's preventing this from happening. It's she's the one who's preventing this from happening. Mother understands that Larry has probably killed himself because of what Joe did, because Joe got away with it, and Larry would have a problem with that. They say numerous times throughout the play that Larry understood the business better than anyone. Yeah, of course he did. He knows what Joe did, and he knows that Joe got away with it. That's why he dies with dignity, right? He falls as a soldier on the battlefield. My brothers aren't coming back in their airplanes because of what my father did. So I'm going to metaphorically fall on my sword by crashing my plane into the mountain, into a sea, into a forest, into somewhere, and I'll never be found again. So his suicide, from Larry's perspective, is a death with dignity to right the wrongs of his father. And Mother already knows this. That's why the note can't be shown to Joe, right? Because Joe will react to this, and Joe probably will not react favorably to it. Now, Joe's suicide. Why does he do it? Why doesn't he just turn himself in and then free Steve Deaver? First of all, Steve Deaver is guilty, right? He signed the paperwork to release the equipment. So it's not a matter of Steve Deaver being guilty or not. It's the fact that Joe should be in jail with him. The two of them are jointly responsible for it. Joe shouldn't have gotten away with it. So Joe going to jail would change nothing. The best that they could do is charge him with perjury, and he would get some jail time for it. But Steve Deaver's convicted. He's not getting out of jail. So no good would come of that, really, because you can't charge someone with a crime twice. It's called double jeopardy, and in our legal system, that just does not work. So why does he do it? Why does he put a bullet in his head? Well, we have to consider that Joe has lived a very difficult life overall. We're told that he's put out when he's 10 years old to fend for himself, and he builds the company from the ground up. Joe's in his 60s when this play takes place, so this is in the 1940s. So he's probably put out in the 1890s to work for himself at the time when the Industrial Revolution is really starting to be taking full swing in this country. So everything that he has built, it's been for the security of his family. And he says that numerous times to Mother, you wanted money, so I did this for you. He tells Chris, the business is for you. It'd be lovely if we could say that Joe's greedy and he's running around counting his hundreds of dollar bills for himself. He's doing this for his family. There's something inherently virtuous and righteous about sacrificing everything for your family. The problem is that Joe goes overboard with that. He sacrifices his honor for his family as well, and that's something that society doesn't completely approve of. Yet notice that the society doesn't frown on him. They still come to his house, they still play cards, they still eat his food. They have no problem with Joe Keller because he did what he needed to do for his family. And the society recognizes that as being appropriate because they went through the Great Depression. That's the time when people had nothing and they struggled for every single penny. And when you've lived through poverty, the last thing you want to do is to go back to it. So how virtuous to make sure that your children do not go through what you went through. You want a better future for them and a better life for them as well. That's why Joe Keller is so protective about the business and why it's so important for Joe that he passed the business along to his sons. That's his redemption for his sacrifices in his life. That's the redemption for his sacrifice of honor, which at first he doesn't see beyond his backyard. That's why when Miller stages this, you notice that it's a very claustrophobic setting. It's only taking place in his backyard. The hedges are very high. You can't see out into the other yards. It's because it's family-centric. This is the nuclear family that emerges from the Second World War. It's all about keeping it in our backyard. That's what's important. That's the single most important thing for them. Now, when Joe, at this point, when we get to Act 3, Chris has already rejected him, right? It's an attempt on Joe's part. He wants to try to remedy the situation, but he's living with this belief that, well, it's just Chris. Because after all, his hair falls out if you overcharge someone for anything. If Larry was alive, he would have understood, right? If Larry were here, he would really understand what's going on in the business. Larry had more of a mind for the business, right? Larry's suicide forces Joe to confront the fact that the son, who best understood the business, rejects him for it. No father should see his son die, and Joe now is responsible for that. He could keep up the idea that his son was still alive somehow, even if he doesn't believe he's really coming home, because Larry wasn't on the planes that Joe manufactured the parts for. So somehow that made it okay. See why Mother wanted to keep the story going? Don't show it to Joe. Don't show it to Joe. And when Chris says to Joe, after he's read this letter to him, and remember, Joe yanks the letter out of Chris's hand and reads the rest of it for himself, we don't know how Larry signs that or what his final words are. But what winds up happening is that when Chris tells him, yeah, what is this telling you? Do you know what you need to do now? Yeah, Joe knows exactly what it is that he needs to do. This, again, is classical Old Testament justice. This is an eye for an eye. When Joe goes back in the house and he kills himself, it's because he's trying to right the wrong of Larry's spilled blood. Larry had no business killing himself. So as a father, he tries to make it right for his son by spilling his own blood. Now, this is sort of a nonsensical mentality because nothing is going to bring Larry back. It's not going to make it right. Yet going to jail isn't going to make it right either. Being sorry isn't enough. Something else larger needs to happen. And that larger is Joe Keller putting a bullet in his head. Now, Joe Keller says he's going to do this, and he's good to his word. For as dishonorable as the act was of sending out the defective parts and then pulling a fast one to get out of having to go to jail, his suicide takes on a sense of honor. And there's another sort of way that suicide is perceived as being honorable. When you would have a hero that would, instead of being captured by the enemy and dragged through the public square for all to frown upon and to be abused by the enemy, the hero would fall on a sword on the battlefield. And the best example of that I can think of for you folks is in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, based upon actual events. Marcus Brutus, when he's lost the campaign, he of course was Caesar's friend and participated in the assassination of Caesar. Rather than be dragged through town as a public spectacle, he commits suicide on the battlefield. Then in the final lines of the play, he's held up as being an honorable man. That's what you do. You die for your ideal. Joe Keller's dying for his ideal. He firmly believed that there was nothing bigger in this world than a father's relationship with his son and a father's duty to his biological son. That is thrown out the window when Larry commits suicide because of what happens to the other pilots. And in Joe's line, what he seems to have learned is that, sure, he was my son, but I think to him they were all my sons. And I guess they were. I guess they were. Then he says, I'll be right down. Now, Joe Keller never intends to come back out. He's decided that the only way he can make this right is to sacrifice himself to right the spilled blood, the wrong spilled blood of Larry. And also to perhaps liberate Chris. Chris wants nothing to do with the money. Joe says to him, if it's tainted, throw it away. It's not my money. I'm an old man. I'm an old dead man. When will I ever get another chance to do anything? So, let me clean the blood. Spill my blood. It's cleaned. Chris can go on and live his life. That will liberate him from whatever it might be. Joe Keller's act is anything but cowardly. It's not that he can't face what he's done. He is facing what he's done. I deserve to be dead because I allowed my son to commit suicide because of my own actions. It's better off if someone like me doesn't exist in society anymore. His way of thinking doesn't jive with the progressive thinking of his sons. And because of that, for him, he rationalizes it as, I need to go. I need to take myself out of the equation. That's not cowardly. That's attempting to redeem himself when everything has been done. Now, I mentioned we have some concerns about one other person. Well, what does that leave Chris? Right, at the end of this play, we have someone who has lost everything. He's lost his whole sense of identity. Remember earlier in the play, he talked about the fact that he never saw Joe as being as being a human, as being another person. He saw him as being his father. And he defined himself by that. My father is a good man. My father is perfect. He's an honorable man. And then he sees the blemishes. And because of that, Chris loses his sense of identity. And Chris says, this is right before he gets shown the letter, right? I can't look at you this way. I can't look at myself. It's interesting that that line almost mirrors Larry's line in the suicide note when he says, I can't face anybody. Larry and Chris are thinking the same thing. At the end, Chris's last lines, what? Mother, I didn't mean to. He's taking responsibility for Joe's death. This is my fault. Do you see the cycle of violence is being perpetuated here? Larry commits suicide because of what Joe has done. Joe commits suicide because of what Larry did, because he feels guilty about that. Now Chris feels guilty about Joe killing himself. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen here? That's why Mother says, don't, dear, don't take it on yourself. Forget now, live. Why live? Well, what are you thinking about doing here, Chris? Are you thinking about killing yourself as well? Right? If that's the case, we have a cycle of violence going through this family line that comes right out of classical Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy. Right? How much blood is enough? When is the wrong righted? How much do people have to sacrifice before we just say, let it go? And that's what Mother is saying here. Because it seems ironic, the whole play is about people who won't take responsibility for their actions. And then at the end, there's this message of, don't take responsibility for your actions. Is Chris responsible? To a point, but it's not completely Chris's fault. He has the right to let the truth be told, that Larry has committed suicide. Joe has a right to know what happened to his son. And he does, and that's how he reacts to it. This is how I've done wrong. Right? So, there's the fear of Chris's suicide. That's why Mother intervenes. That's why she's the only one left standing. Larry has fallen. Joe has fallen. Chris has fallen to some degree. She's still trying to prop him up. And this ties into that whole idea of Larry's tree as being a symbol. And that gets read a variety of ways as well. A symbol by its very nature has a variety of different meanings. Of course, the way it's interpreted for us is that the memorial tree falls because of the fact that Larry's going to be coming back. Well, Larry does come back, but not in bodily form. He comes back in the form of the letter. So that interpretation winds up being realized. Larry does come back, and we find out that he is dead. He is dead like the tree that has been struck down. And that's another way that that symbol can be read. Larry's tree is dead because Larry is dead. So the strike down is appropriate. The tree itself also kind of represents Joe Keller, right? Because Joe is really the one who produces the family, right? The family comes from him. The tree is struck down. By the end of the play, Joe Keller has been struck down as well. It also represents the family as a whole. By the end of the family, by the end of the play, the Keller family no longer exists. So that tree is symbolically related to all the suicides that happen, right? The undoing of the family itself. Now, there's a lot that happens in this particular play, but since people tend to be kind of hung up on Joe Keller's suicide, I figured that this would be a good opportunity to really talk about that and discuss some alternative readings of it. Again, you may still think that Joe Keller is a coward. However, realize that not every suicide can rightly be defined as cowardly, if any. Maybe there's a larger picture that we don't understand about what's going on in the minds of the character. And if that's the case, maybe we as a society, we need to better psychologically understand the people around us in order to prevent us from prematurely judging them. So I started with talking about Matt Hughes. Was Matt a coward because he psychologically couldn't handle anything? If he is, then so was Larry. Let's be honest, psychological reasons for why he killed himself. Where does Brittany Maynard factor into that? Where does Joe Keller now factor into that? Are you totally convinced that suicide is a cowardly thing? It's not a debate anyone could solve, but certainly it's something worth pondering. And certainly we need to realize that as individuals and as a society, we're directly responsible for the way that people respond to our everyday actions. That's maybe the message of All My Sons. We have a larger social responsibility to those around us, and what we do with ourselves, physically, mentally, psychologically, we're responsible for the people around us and for their well-being as well.